All right. Hey there to everyone aiming for those top spots in the UPSC.
That's right, and today we're diving deep into a topic that's a bit like a double-edged sword: nationalism.
Yeah. And whether you're prepping for the mains or prelims, getting a solid grasp on this is key.
Absolutely, because nationalism can be a powerful force for good. Think about all those movements for freedom and self-determination.
India's own independence struggle is a prime example, right?
Right, but then you also have to think about the flip side.
Exactly. The darker side that fueled conflicts like the world wars.
It's almost like this paradox, this incredible force for unity.
But then it can also lead to aggression and even oppression.
So how do we make sense of this?
I think we need to unpack these different shades of nationalism. And one key distinction to understand is that between national pride,
And national chauvinism.
which is something the UPSC loves to test you on,
Yeah, and for good reason.
because chauvinism takes that pride and basically warps it into this belief that one nation is just inherently better than all the others.
And that often gets tied to ideas of racial or ethnic superiority.
The slippery slope for sure, and a dangerous one too.
And nowhere is that more evident than in Nazi Germany.
Right. Their belief in the supremacy of the so-called Aryan race led to those horrific atrocities.
A chilling reminder of just how toxic nationalism can become.
Absolutely. And speaking of these darker sides, where does something like xenophobia fit into all of this?
Well, xenophobia, this fear or hatred of foreigners, can be driven by those nationalistic feelings.
Is it always an inevitable outcome?
It's not a guaranteed outcome, no. It really hinges on the specific context, the historical and social circumstances.
Which brings us to a question that's not just theoretical, but also incredibly relevant to international relations.
A key area for the UPSC.
Can nationalism ever be truly peaceful, or does it always carry the seeds of conflict?
Now, that's a debate that still rages on among scholars. Some argue that the very essence of
With
nationalism
its emphasis on national interests and sometimes that sense of rivalry.
makes conflict almost inevitable.
But there are others who say it is possible to have a kind of nationalism that's more inclusive.
Focused on cooperation rather than confrontation.
It's all about striking that balance, right?
Absolutely.
Definitely something to ponder as you prep for those essay questions.
Now, to help us really get to grips with the complexities of nationalism, our deep dive today focuses on three thinkers whose theories are essential for the UPSC.
We're talking about Ernest Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and Anthony D. Smith.
Each one offering a unique lens through which to view this intricate concept of national identity.
So let's start with Gellner.
Gellner, with his modernist view, argues that nationalism, it basically emerged alongside industrial societies
So as societies modernize, they needed a common culture.
and language, primarily for economic efficiency.
So according to Gellner, nations aren't these ancient, timeless entities. They're actually relatively recent,
They're constructs.
shaped by those forces of modernization.
Fascinating when you think about India's own journey.
Right. India, with its incredible diversity.
A fantastic case study for Gellner's theory.
Could such a diverse nation even exist without this unifying force of modernization?
And that shared national identity.
Makes you think? Right.
It does.
Now, let's shift gears to Benedict Anderson and his idea of imagined communities.
Now, what Anderson brilliantly captured was this idea that nations are imagined because we can't possibly know every single member personally.
Yet we still feel this shared bond, right?
A connection rooted in commonalities, but imagined commonalities.
It's like being part of this massive club where you haven't met most of the members.
Precisely. And Anderson argues that this sense of shared identity is really cultivated through those symbols, those rituals, and even the media.
Which plays a huge role in shaping how we understand what it means to be Indian.
Think about it.
Constantly bombarded with images and stories.
That feed into this national narrative.
It's true. It's almost subconscious.
It
Makes you wonder, what are those symbols or narratives that make you feel Indian? What evokes that sense of shared identity for you?
Take a moment and just think about that.
Now, for a slightly different take, we turn to Anthony D. Smith. He doesn't completely disagree with this idea of nations as modern constructs.
Not entirely.
But he adds this really interesting layer of historical and cultural depth.
He does. He argues that while nations might be relatively recent in their modern form, they draw upon these pre-existing ethnic ties, shared myths, and those cultural memories.
That ethnic core, as he calls it.
It's like nations are built upon these foundations, using elements from their past to shape their present identity. Imagine building a house. You might use modern materials and techniques, but the foundation is still rooted in the ground beneath it.
Such a compelling point, especially when you consider India's long and intricate history. Makes you wonder how much of India's national identity is rooted in these ancient ties and shared cultural legacies. Something to chew on as you prepare for those UPSC essays.
So, we've explored this multifaceted nature of nationalism, and we've delved into the theories of Gellner, Anderson, and Smith, giving you hopefully a good foundation for those UPSC exams. But now let's look at how this idea of the nation state, a modern concept, is being reshaped by a force that's changing the world: globalization.
Almost like globalization is constantly pushing and pulling against the very idea of nations, right? We're seeing this interconnectedness growing, people, ideas, and economies all crossing borders like never before.
And for our listeners prepping for the UPSC, understanding globalization's impact, well, it's crucial, especially when we're talking about things like sovereignty and migration, those hot button issues in international relations.
So let's start with migration. It's a phenomenon that's been around forever, right? I mean, people have always been on the move.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the Silk Road, those vast trade networks that stretched across continents, or the migrations that happened after huge historical events like the fall of the Roman Empire. Human history is all about movement and interaction.
Yeah, and even more recently, we've seen those mass migrations spurred by colonization, the slave trade, and indentured labor. These movements have really left their mark on the world, changing demographics, cultures, even the geopolitical landscape.
And what's fascinating is how globalization has just accelerated these trends. We live in a world that's hyperconnected, with communication happening instantly, transportation getting faster and faster, and economies becoming more globalized. It's impacting migration in ways we've never seen before.
That's so true. I mean, just think about it. Someone in a rural village in India can connect with job opportunities in, say, Dubai or London, all with a few taps on their phone. Globalization has made the world smaller, more accessible, and that influences both the push and pull factors when it comes to migration.
And here's a key concept for all our UPSC aspirants out there. Understanding the difference between those push and pull factors is essential, especially if you're tackling questions about economic and political theory.
Okay, let's break it down then. So, push factors. Those are the things driving people away from their home countries. Things like poverty, lack of opportunities, political instability, even conflict or persecution.
You got it. And on the flip side, you have those pull factors. These are what attract people to a new country. Think better job prospects, higher wages, a more stable political environment, even sometimes just the appeal of a different lifestyle.
And globalization, with all its interconnectedness and that constant flow of information, it actually makes both these push and pull factors more intense. It makes people aware of the differences between countries and also gives them the means to act on those differences, whether it's seeking better opportunities or fleeing difficult situations.
It's this really complex interplay of factors, and grasping those dynamics is key to analyzing migration patterns, both historically and in today's world.
And it's not just about individuals migrating, right? Globalization has also given rise to those transnational communities and diasporas, groups of people who hold on to those strong ties to their homelands even while living in another country.
Exactly. The Jewish diaspora is a classic example. Communities spread across the globe, but maintaining this strong sense of shared identity and connection to their ancestral homeland. But now, with globalization, we're seeing more and more of these transnational communities taking root.
Yeah, like the Indian diaspora. You see these thriving communities in countries like the UK, the US, Canada, the Gulf states. They often maintain these strong cultural and economic ties with India, sending remittances back home, investing in businesses, even influencing political discourse.
And technology plays a massive role here, allowing people to stay connected across continents in ways that weren't even imaginable just a few decades ago. Think cheap air travel, instant communication through the internet and mobile phones, even those social media platforms that connect people across borders. It's changed what it means to live in a diaspora.
It's fascinating how these transnational communities challenge those traditional ideas about national identity. If someone feels a strong connection to both their homeland and their adopted country, where does their allegiance lie?
That's a question that's becoming more and more relevant in our globalized world. And it brings us to this concept that's not just academically interesting, highly relevant for the UPSC too: hybridity.
Hybridity. So that's all about how identities are becoming more mixed and fluid in a globalized world, right?
Yeah.
Challenging those rigid definitions of belonging, raising questions about what it even means to be a citizen in this 21st century.
Think about it. Someone might be born in India, grow up in the US, work in Singapore, and have family scattered all over the world. Their identity becomes this tapestry woven from different cultural threads, reflecting just how interconnected our world really is.
And this concept of hybridity is particularly important for cultural studies, which could be a potential essay topic for the UPSC mains exam.
Mhm.
It's a way of looking at culture not as something fixed or unchanging, but as something dynamic, constantly evolving through interactions and exchanges.
So we've got globalization shaking things up, migration patterns shifting, and the rise of hybrid identities. It's a lot to process, but it leads us to that million-dollar question. Is the nation state, this fundamental unit of the modern world, actually on the decline?
All right, so we're nearing the end of our deep dive into nationalism. We've untangled its complexities, we've looked at the theories of Gellner, Anderson, and Smith, and we've even tackled the impact of globalization.
And if you stuck with us this far, you're well on your way to acing this crucial topic in your UPSC exams. But remember, it's not just about cramming facts and figures. It's about really understanding these ideas and being able to think critically about them.
Yeah, the UPSC examiners are looking for more than just rote memorization. They want to see that you can analyze, you can evaluate, you can form your own arguments. So let's tie everything together and address that big question. Is the nation state in decline?
It's a question that's generating a lot of debate among scholars and policymakers around the world. Some argue that globalization is chipping away at national sovereignty, making those traditional boundaries less meaningful.
I mean, look at the rise of all those transnational organizations like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF. Their reach often goes beyond what individual nation states can do.
And then you have the increasing power of global markets, multinational corporations operating across borders, wielding a lot of influence both economically and politically. It's a world where capital, information, culture, they all flow so freely, really challenging those traditional boundaries.
Feels like we're heading towards a more interconnected world, where national identities might become less and less important.
Hmm.
But is that really what's happening?
Well, there's a counter-argument to consider. Many say that the nation-state is far from dead. They point out that nations still hold the ultimate power. They control their borders. They issue currencies. Their citizens are loyal to them.
And they make the point that globalization is often driven by nation states themselves. They're the ones making those trade deals, setting immigration policies, shaping the global landscape in all sorts of ways. It's not like this external force acting on them passively.
Exactly. Nations are adapting, evolving to meet the challenges and opportunities of globalization. They're not simply vanishing.
So the future of the nation state is still kind of uncertain. There's this tension between these forces pulling us towards more global integration and those that are reinforcing national identities.
And that brings us to our final thought-provoking question for you, our dedicated UPSC aspirants. In this increasingly interconnected world, what's the future of national identity?
Will it adapt and change, blending with other identities to create something new and hybrid? Or will it eventually fade away, replaced by a sense of global citizenship?
It's a question without any easy answers, but it's one you should grapple with as you prep for those UPSC essays. Show the examiners that you can tackle complex issues, that you can consider multiple perspectives, and that you can form well-reasoned arguments of your own. That's what sets you apart as a top candidate.
And hey, you never know. You might even come up with an answer worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize.
We can only hope. And if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations of these fascinating and complex topics. Share this episode with your fellow UPSC aspirants. We're all in this together.
Absolutely. And best of luck with your exams. We're cheering you on every step of the way.